call the member for Dunkley.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. As speakers before me have noted, this bill is the first of the government's responses to the Stevens Review, and of course is a very important response. The Stevens Review was released by this government, the 2020 Stevens Review was released by this government in March of this year, and I was really pleased to see the Minister make a number of commitments on behalf of the Australian government, committing to expanding options for industry to self-classify content and to providing exemptions from classification for foreign language films distributed by public libraries and routine exhibitions hosted by cultural institutions, and to removing the need to reclassify content that has already been classified for television. Of course, we see that commitment come to fruition in this bill. The government also committed to consult with industry and other key stakeholders on broader classification reforms, and that consultation is something that the Minister and the Minister's office have been very diligent about doing. And the third announcement, and is something that I wanted to speak briefly about, is to seek agreement of state and territory attorney-generals as co-partners in the scheme to introduce a mandatory minimum classification of R18+ for games which contain simulated gambling, and M for computer games containing paid loot boxes. I'm the chair of the Standing Committee, the House of Reps Standing Committee into Social Policy and Legal Affairs, and we recently finished quite a long inquiry into the regulatory regime and harm reduction for online gambling, and it included looking at loot boxes and simulated gambling. And as we concluded in the report that we recently handed down, the evidence was clear that young Australians, children, are increasingly being exposed to gambling-like activities. They're widely available and they're marketed to them on all digital platforms. And there is a problem with the regulation and age gating. And one only has to speak to parents to know that that is the case. My friends talk about their 9, 10 and 11-year-old children using loot boxes and simulated gambling in online gaming that they didn't realise they were using until they really stopped and interrogated the game. And mind you, one of my friend's child in particular being smart enough to know how to use her credit card to pay. And you don't have to have anecdotes like that. The research that was presented to the committee suggests that simulated gambling in interactive games normalises gambling for children and young people and carries risks for lifelong addictive behaviours and the range of harms that online gambling causes. There is still some debate within the evidence about whether there's a causal link or simply correlation between harms of loot box features and young people gambling with real money and experiencing harm from gambling in adulthood. But the view of the committee clearly, and my view, is we shouldn't be waiting. We shouldn't be waiting for another generation to be exposed to something that we know is at the very least associated with, and some of the evidence suggests causal, for significant harms, when we know the significant harms that online gambling already caused to adults in our community, which is why I was very pleased and the committee was very pleased with the government's commitment about dealing with this in part through changes to the classification scheme. The world has changed since most of us were children so significantly. Sometimes it's hard to understand the changes, and I had no idea what a loot box was before starting this inquiry that we recently finished. And it's yet another way that technology has both improved lives but also brings with it the potential and the reality for causing harm, and raises again that it is incumbent on governments to be alert to this, to regulate and also work with industry and not just always be playing catch-up. And it's why the reforms that are contained in this bill and that the government has committed to implementing are so important. I think we've reached a point now where most people understand that it's not viable often anymore to just sit back and say, let's see how this piece of technology evolves, or let's see what happens with this and then we can work out what to do with it, which at various times I think has been an appropriate way to regulate and to legislate. But things are changing so fast, and the harms are sometimes not able to be predicted, that we have to always be looking at reviewing where we're at and what sort of framework can we put in place that has the capacity to deal with the known and the unknown changes that are coming. It may well have to be tweaked and changed as we go, but at least to have a framework that can deal with these things. And the classification systems framework hasn't been updated for so long that it certainly hasn't been able to do that. Just returning briefly to loot boxes and simulated gaming, there is no doubt that the government's commitment is a good first step in ensuring that consumers can make more informed purchasing decisions and is consistent with the evidence we received in the inquiry about the harm of these types of games. Some games contain loot boxes more closely resembling gambling than others and therefore have a greater risk of harm. I think it's worth, as the government is conducting its consultation, to consider a granular approach to determining classification of games with loot boxes through the National Classification Scheme. Games contain loot boxes that can be purchased and which closely resemble gambling should be given a higher classification. There's also an issue with online app stores. They vary in their age rating systems. For example, Steam, a popular computer game storefront, not requiring game developers to classify games at all. There is some work to be done there as well, I believe, so that ratings are uniform across all platforms and consumers can have a clear and consistent information to help them make safer choices. The committee, the Social Policy and Legal Affairs Committee, also received submissions about a number of consumer protections that the government could consider to complement changes to the National Classification Scheme when we're talking about loot boxes and simulated gambling. Things like public information campaigns to educate consumers, parents, caregivers, teachers and young people on elements of simulated gambling. The need to make sure that warning labels that come with gambling, online gambling tools are effective, that people, particularly parents, understand what it means, that there's a risk-based element in the game, and that there be consideration of incorporating effective simulated gambling warning labels into the National Classification Scheme, and that we look at what minimum consumer protections for interactive games should be and whether any of them need legislative mechanisms. Spending controls, transparent odds and drop rates for items, algorithmic loot box figures disabled as a default setting, allowing players to opt in, for example. A number of international jurisdictions have looked at banning loot boxes and simulated gambling. The committee didn't feel that we had enough evidence to say whether that's an effective way to address the issue and whether, in fact, it would have more positive than negative consequences. But there are examples out there that the government can also monitor to see what's the outcome of different approaches in different jurisdictions. So I'm confident that the minister will be, in her consultations, looking at all of these issues, because I know that this government is committed to making the classification scheme fit for purpose for the modern time, but also putting harm reduction at the heart of how we look at issues like gambling and simulated gambling, which, as I started off, is often a gateway, if we can put it like that, to actual gambling. I'm very pleased that we have a government that's acting on the Stevens review, that will be taking seriously classification and working with industry to make sure it works. And I commend this piece of legislation and congratulate the government and the minister for your commitment to continuing down this process.